Good morning, everyone. Let's see, how do I click? That'll do it. All right. Well, let me ask one quick question. How many of you, actually, there'll be two. First, how many of you care about the future? Good, good. If you don't have your hand raised, I think you're probably just looking at your phone. Two, how many of you think that you have the ability to influence it? Good. Half and half. All right. What I want to give you today is an overview of some things that you will need to be paying attention to, things that you can use to help you build that influence, to actually drive positive outcomes. Because the future is not something that we can just say, well, it's going to happen. We don't know what it'll be. And it's this uncertain thing. There are tactical ways to use the future to help us understand the present and the potentials of the future. I'm Jeremy. I'm actually an academically trained futurist, or I have a degree in strategic foresight. And what that means is I look at change, do research around what changes are happening in the environments around us, and then work to figure out what does that mean? What could this do here, or how could we work together to solve that problem? It sounds like strategy, but it's also really, really long-term horizons, 10, 20, 50, 100 years sometimes. And this is not about making predictions. And I love that the prediction was in the title of like the event. And I was like, we're not making predictions, because predictions are actually based on probabilities, which is still a possibility, not necessarily a certainty. My personal mission is to help technologists, emerging technologists, ultimately anybody, but I'm specifically focused on folks in technology to help you learn some of the basics of what it means to be a futures thinker. So um, before I get into some of the trends and things that you're probably really interested in seeing, I want to share this amazing quote. If you have never watched The Expanse, and I'm always amazed when I ask, there's at least half the room that has never seen The Expanse or read the books, and you're missing out. But this is a quote from season 2, episode 6, that's the terrifying or the wonderful and terrible thing about technology. It changes everything. As you get into your journey, or if you're already in your journey as a technologist, you are changing things. You are a change maker, and change is what drives the future. And so we are at the center of a lot of things. But we also have to make sure we're not overdoing it, because there are a lot of other types of change and other influences that we need to pay attention to, so that we don't just build technology for technology's sake, but that we incorporate a bigger view of the world. So really the fundamental question is, what if we could anticipate those changes before they happen, and what those impacts are? That opens up opportunity, that opens up direction and decisions that we can make, hopefully for the better. So maybe, there we go. One key thing to have in mind is that if you look into the future, there's not one path. Think of it as a tree. It's plural. There are futures. There are lots of ways that the future can play out. And nobody knows what it will look like. Nobody knows how it will work. Nobody knows what exact path. But we can look at those plural possibilities and assign different categories to them. This is maybe a little hard to see, but think of this as the present is the tip at the very left, and the future is everything afterwards. It could go in any number of these directions. And the point is that some of these directions might be preferable, might be the one we want to have. There's a certain amount of possibility that we think is most likely. There's some that are preposterous, that are, I mean, maybe the laws of physics allow it, but it probably isn't very likely, and something that we maybe don't need to think about. But there's preferable is one that requires value judgment. And then there's others that are like the projected, which is like, if we just kind of assume the world continues on, things keep going the way they are, that's the projected future. And that's the one we have to pay the most attention to, as one to not buy into, because tomorrow will not be the thing that you think it will be if you just assume it will continue on. Change is constant, and things are always evolving. This is called the futures cone, if you want to look it up. This is a really good mental model, if you have this, of the future, to place yourself in and keep this in the back pocket of your mind. So because that future is uncertain, that doesn't mean we can't explore it. And so there are lots of tools and techniques, and I'm not going to have time to go into a lot of that today, but it is really fundamental to how we as technologists need to think about the future, is that we can explore those possibilities. You do this when you build a prototype. So I have a small framework for doing a really simple amount of futures thinking in your everyday life. So take a picture of this. This is the thing, this is the skill, this is the habit. First is you do exploring. You might already do this. You look at your news feeds, you look at whatever social media you have. You gather resources and knowledge and information. Now, that's kind of like raw data. So think about it from the perspective of, okay, what's just going on? But also looking at it from the perspective of not just what's going on, but what's really happening. Is it this product announcement, or is it how this product maybe positions itself and changes the workers' behaviors? Or what does it mean for those who are going to use that technology or who are impacted by that technology? So don't just look also at one industry. It's not just tech. You have to look broadly. The second part then is taking that information, hopefully in a collection that you've got it labeled and tagged, in which I use a product called Reader by Readwise. But the idea is that you actually have like a database of some of these things. You're keeping track of these. You in the middle are starting to see, okay, where are these trends? How do you make sense of all of this kind of raw information? And a lot of this is not necessarily hard to do if you're just kind of casually keeping up with it, doing a little bit of labeling, taking a few notes. You'll start to notice these connections. And that's the middle part. What are the connections? What does this all maybe mean? Not that you know for sure, but this is a way of kind of exploring what might this turn into. And then finally, strategizing. This is where you actually take those insights and say, what am I going to do about it? And this is lots of options on this. And design thinking is a great platform if you want to look up those things for actually taking those ideas and stressing them and building them up. A lot of those techniques are useful for this. But strategizing is based on what you've made sense of, what are you going to do about it? Sounds very simple. Many of you do these types of things, maybe not as structured as you could, but I wanted to explore this with you. And this is the kind of habit that I think will make strong technologists who also think about the impacts, the direction things go, and ultimately how to make the best of the opportunities and avoid the fallbacks, pitfalls. Uh, this is a wonderful quote from William Gibson. He said, "The future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed." This is the golden insight that allows us to do that sense making and searching, because there are glimpses of the future now. If you've ever heard of the hype cycle from Gartner, it's an analytical tool they use just to kind of describe technologies and trends and things. But the idea is really solid in the sense that at the beginning, there's little signals that there's something happening, right? Startups are starting to form around this technology, and it kind of grows into something bigger. Well, if you catch those early signals, it's not that it will become a big trend, but that you have a sense of awareness of it. And you don't have to catch everything, but that if you keep yourself rooted in those things over time, you start to notice the wheat from the chaff, the good from the bad. So that's how this works. The future is intricately linked to the present. So let's actually get into the trends. Please click. Not sure where the clicker is supposed to point. All right, so I have 10 trends that I've pulled out from my research. They're not the only trends, but I tried to pick some that were outside of maybe the standard view, as well as a little bit about why they're in that list. So these are 6 categories that I look at when I look at things. I was told the clicker was finicky. There it goes. It's called Steep V. And if you're looking for information, these are good broad categories to make sure that you're looking across a multitude of vectors, that you're not focusing too much on just technical technology type news. If you're only looking at Verge or TechCrunch or something like that, you're missing the bigger picture. So I label my news based on, is this a social change? Is this a technical, economic, political, environment? Or is it a values or like a cultural change? And often it's more than one. So I use this as a way to label and categorize to make sure that I'm looking broadly and not too narrowly. So the 10 trends are these, and I'll go each one a little bit more in depth individually. So first is data lawsuits. There's a couple of, well, there's always a lot of lawsuits. It seems to be a norm. But one of the interesting things about the lawsuits is that they're trying to fill in gaps where laws don't yet cover. And so this is an important thing to be paying attention to. The existing laws and the way that laws are made moves at a different speed than people can sue and litigate. And so the divergence of those processes is a really important thing to make sure you pay attention to, because lawsuits can affect essentially the law. Even until a law is made, it can become kind of like a law. And it's different in some countries, but this is very true, particularly in the US, where I'm mostly looking at. So lawyers and judges make a lot of the ultimate arguments for what is right and what is wrong. So when you think about your space and where you're at, you also want to think about, okay, what are some of the lawsuits going on? There's lawsuits around, like Stable Diffusion has had some around the rights of images on training data. So that leads to the questions of, okay, in the future, will we have to generate all synthetic data because we can't use any other images? Can we scrape data? What are the rules about that? A lot of that's going to be resolved potentially, I think, through these types of lawsuits. You can look at a lot of them. In some of them, you can find the whole like legal briefs and things like that. Probably not that depth is needed, but some of the summaries of that would be really helpful to keep track of where things are. So next, stricter accountability. And what do I mean by that? I don't mean this as you might think at first. There's a country, Vanuatu, I think is how you say it, recently was able to get the UN to call on the International Court of Justice to consider legal obligations of other nations in order to affect climate change. So, or because of climate change. So if you have had an influence on climate change, they're advocating that the highest international court, the International Court of Justice, would be able to assign repercussions to nations who are not either fulfilling their pledges or have had impacts in this area. What does this have to do with AI? Well, this is not a technical change. This is a change in how do we govern globally, and that could be a thing that also affects technology. So this is a good signal of something outside of technology that we should be thinking about. What kind of accountability will the global community potentially apply? And it might be in technology spaces. AI is seen as a very big, very potentially disruptive, or is a disruptive technology that people are going to want to pay attention to, of course, just like climate change and some of the other things that are going on. So what kinds of accountability will the global community apply? And this is why you want to pay attention to a broader thing, broader world. Polarization of opinion. Anybody notice this? Yeah. There's the court of public opinion, and there's the actual court. We're talking here about the public opinion. There is a lot of noise out there, and so it can be really hard to figure out what do people actually believe about a lot of things. There's polls, and polls show that the past polls were wrong, or that people were asked the wrong questions. It gets really hard to figure out what are people thinking, but then the war for their hearts and minds, maybe I shouldn't say war, but the advocacy of people's hearts and minds is an important place for us to also be engaged, us collectively at least. A few months ago, several tech leaders were on in the same week, several tech leaders were on the news in like 60-minute segments, 60 minutes, I can't remember what the other one was, but they were having these long expose sit downs. And of course, AI came up, and you've got very different perspectives on what AI is, where it's going, and the story. This is an important piece. These are people who are leading large companies, and they're telling a story. And we should see these different opinions, and we should try to reconcile these things. But that comes down into the public opinion as well. So how do these things influence the direction? Those things could potentially affect, where lawmakers all of a sudden start appearing, where lawsuits start appearing. It could affect where advertising and other modes of influence start to go. So where are these things going in your area particularly? All right, shifting beneficiaries. So this is a question about where does the technology actually, who does it actually benefit? And this is a challenge because every technology that's developed is usually found in other areas than it was originally designed to be used. There's lots of ways that technology kind of blossoms into new realms because someone said, hey, this also could work here, or these things could be combined. But we can't anticipate all of the possibilities of who will be benefited or who will be harmed or how these things will all play out in the end. So one of the things that we have to think through is where these things can go. This is where we can do some scenario planning or even just writing little short fiction stories like, hey, if this happened, you've maybe heard of Black Mirror as an example of like the extreme case. I don't recommend necessarily that, but the idea that if you were to take several steps down this technological path, right, or we merge a couple things together and you start to explore what's the world like at that point, you might find that new people or new groups could benefit from it. You might find the opposite, that it might end up harming groups that you didn't anticipate. And this is a good example in Australia, a way that they avoided this problem. A grocery chain called Woolworths implemented a checkout system. And they did the process of thinking through, okay, how does this affect everybody? And they ultimately came up with a secondary mode for folks who wouldn't want to use this automated checkout system because it also used scanning, facial scanning and things. Um, they protected the facial scanning data from ever leaving the device. So even those who monitored in the store backroom security office or something like that, the faces were always blurred. They protected privacy. They did the extra work to try to solve some of these problems ahead of time before there was any other, complaints or whatnot, as well as still giving opt-out solutions where you could use regular payment options with a person and things like that. So they helped figure out where the benefits, because some folks, also those who need extra assistance, perhaps checking out, would not have been able to use some of this new technology the way it was set up. So they thought through and tried to minimize the influence and impact as much as they could. That they did a really good job. Automation. So uh, we have a stock market which is always trying to like anticipate, predict, like what is a company's value in the long time. We think of the wisdom of the crowd, essentially, right? No one person knows enough, but together in a market, everybody knows. There was a paper done a few months back by some research at the University of Florida, and what they did was using a lot of news headlines about a particular set of stocks. They would analyze them and use Chat GPT. They actually use several different language models. They used a series of them and were comparing them, but they were able to, based on the day's news, create an algorithm for making stock purchases or sell, and that was able to provide above market return. So the idea here is that they figured out a way to game the system. In short, how can we think of the same thing in other technologies? When these things are merged, what other types of disruptions or potential problems would arise? In this case, if we have stocks as a what's supposed to be the wisdom of the crowd, it's already highly automated with lots of computerized transactions and things in the background, but there's still a lot of humans in the loop. If it were just taken out where it's just computers doing this process, how does that change the nature of investing in the financial global market? Those are really big questions, but how would your technology or the things that you're building influence or impact all of this as well? So this is an area that I'm looking at is how do people utilize these things to get this like competitive advantage? And how long will that advantage last? Maybe that advantage doesn't work once everybody has access to that same technology. But we need to think about what's next with those types of things. There's an example of electric vehicles in the United States and globally have been on the rise, and there's incentives by various governments usually to get them increased for, we're usually looking at decreasing emissions, and this is a big avenue for that. But there are some very interesting reasons why there can be pushback. And when I say nostalgia, what I really mean is what are ways or places that people or systems are going to push back against whatever you're developing. So electric vehicles are very important for a lot of the self-driving space because many of the car platforms of the future are also integrated with the self-driving space. And there's actually two places where one is Switzerland and one in Wyoming, where governments or regulators were trying to actually prevent people from using electric vehicles. But they're very, very different, and this is an important piece. So there are very different reasons why they were doing this. In Switzerland, they were considering the implications in a remote area with winter conditions, with batteries, if there are power outages, they don't want people charging their vehicles. And so, which makes sense. You don't want to necessarily be putting electricity into cars when people needed to maybe heat their homes or things like that. So they wanted to figure out the right balance between limiting access or being able to control how at least the charging systems worked. Wyoming was a different case where in the state of Wyoming, there was a bill introduced by some individuals. It didn't actually pass, but their goal was to phase out electric vehicles by 2030, which is the opposite of what everybody else seems to be thinking, because this was largely a political stunt. But the point being that this was a pushback against, we don't need this technology. You don't need to change our lives. We're good as is. Whatever their mental model is, it's something along those lines. And so you need to be aware of that as well. What will push back against your technology? Well, there will be people who will feel disadvantaged or just in opposition to it for any number of reasons. And it's something that we all need to be looking out for. Talked about laws and court cases a little bit, but regulation is always one of the biggest challenges. Europe, US, Canada, globally, regulation is uneven. You know this, it's no big secret. But recently, India was reviewing its stance on AI and regulation. And it has a Ministry of Technology, I believe it's called. And they ultimately decided, instead of trying to regulate and introduce kind of some framework for how AI should behave or any rules there, they decided to leave it largely open because they wanted to ensure growth. And that was the main statement that they put out, was around innovation being the key thing here. And because of that, there's going to be obviously lower regulation in that situation compared to maybe some other locations where there's higher regulation. Well, that affects where investment goes. That affects what technologies might be able to be developed or how they're able to be trained or built or shared and things like that. So investments and regulations are intricately linked. And so these are important things to be paying attention to, and investors do it. We as technologists also need to be at least loosely familiar with some of these types of things. So it's really hard in a global world to think what I do here can go everywhere. But if you're familiar with something called GDPR, which is the European Global Data, I forget the name, the acronym, but it's basically data regulation in Europe. It applies to everybody everywhere, essentially. If you handle any European citizens' data, you're subject to their fines and jurisdiction. So there's a lot of rules based around that. This kind of broadens it out even further. What other types of regulation do you need to be looking at? And again, you, company, organization, right? Everybody. I think almost there. Sorry, this is all right. Software 2.0. Have you heard this term? Software 1.0 is humans writing algorithms and code. Software 2.0 is more or less machine learning. And what happens when machine learning can train machine learning? Or can humans get out of the loop? Can software just write itself? And certainly we've probably heard of cases and experiments of this in different ways. This was an example from, I believe this was in Uber research, something called POET, Paired Open-Ended Trailblazer, was a system where it was a model that was trained to train another model that would learn physics. And so with this ability, it's like they could run it overnight and the system next day could actually operate. And it's like, when you take the human out of the loop, which a lot of this also makes sense because the system can be really good, right? Some of these things are really good problems for software to be solving itself. What does that change? How does it change the way that we create things? How does it change the skills that we need? Does it shift us as developers from writing raw code to observing and responding to behaviors of code written by something else? What is the nature of that problem and space? So I think software 2.0 space is a very interesting one that's going to evolve, and we've got to see, observability, responsible AI, be able to detect bias and things like that, all kind of fall into that bucket. All right, I'm going to wrap it up real quick because I am low on time, but you've probably heard there are scarcity issues with things like water. and sometimes electricity. We've had issues in Texas, where I live, a couple of times where we lost power for like a week during freezes because of weather conditions. The lake that is outside of Austin is at about 35% capacity right now, and we're still not doing enough, in my opinion, to save water. But one of the things that will affect how we develop technology is what are resources we have available to build those things, whether it's hardware or to operate that software. And one of those is water scarcity is going to affect where data centers can be. Because if you don't have enough water to cool a data center, the data center shouldn't probably be there. So places like in the middle of a desert where there's not a lot of water, places like Phoenix where there are a lot of data centers, are going to be really difficult to invest in. And we also need to think about how can we reduce that, potentially eliminate the usage of water or reduce our electricity footprint. This is going to be a really important aspect to all of the development we do, especially in AI, because there is a lot of energy consumption. There was a paper that estimated that ChatGPT took 185,000 gallons of water to be trained for GPT-3. That was 3. And that about every 20 to 50 prompts that it responds to is another bottle of water, like a regular bottle of water, worth of water used to process. So that goes a lot of water. Where we become more scarce and resource constrained, that's going to make it harder and harder for AI and systems to run. All right, and last one is integral values. This is the shifting of how we as a culture and as a global community, and it's not evenly distributed, of course, start to view ourselves. I recently read a book called The Dawn of Everything, and it really pushes back on some of this narrative of like, there's this march of progress that you might have learned a bit about in history classes or as just sort of anecdotally as a kid, that like humans go from cavemen to agriculture to building cities to countries, and then we're on this progression. This book pushes back on the idea that there's this like linear one path progression. It opens it up to the story of humans are much more diverse and had much greater diversity in how they operated, how they lived, how they wanted to structure themselves in the early eras that we're still uncovering with archaeology. And when I think about the story there is that the values and the systems and choices we have today, a lot of them are based around trying to consolidate towards a small set of options. Right? We have a fairly limited set of options of like global governance and things like that. How might we change to allow a broader set of values? What kinds of values will those be in the future that we embrace and incorporate into our decision making? So this is a very meta type discussion and something that's not easily just like picked up. This is something you have to wrestle with and engage with and travel, get to know people from different backgrounds, figuring out ways to bring that into your space. So integral values are an important driver of ultimately how we choose to think about things and make decisions. All right. So future is everywhere. It could be anything. We don't know what the possibilities even are all the way, but we know a lot of them. But it's still rooted to this moment, this present moment, and where things are, because the present is this interesting point in time. We can look back into the past and we can see all the things that happened. And you can actually think about it in the past. There are actually lots of ways that we could have maybe gotten to this moment. In the future, there's lots of places we might end up going. The important thing is that as we look at the present, we can still see those signs, right? This simplified format. How do we explore? How do we sense make? And then how do we strategize to incorporate the future into our plans today? So this is ultimately what I leave you with. And I think it's our responsibility. The important thing for all of us, whether you're just starting or you've been in the field for 30 years, the more you consider what the future is like and bring that into your conversations, the better I think our outcomes will be collectively. So thank you very much. I don't think we have time for questions, or do we?
Sorry?
Do we have time for questions? No.
Just for one. We'll have again. During lunch we'll have networking, so you will be able to ask questions.
Yeah. Yeah. You can chat with me. Yes. Oh, why do you ask me that question? So the question is, what's one thing you're most excited about and most concerned about, essentially? Um, I'm most concerned about our ability to have conversation, having reasoned discussion. That seems to be my main concern. But I'm also kind of on the flip side optimistic that because we have tools and technologies and capabilities, we can actually get to know people in ways that we never could before. How will that play out? How will that work? Obviously, we've been doing this for a while now, especially through the internet era. But I think we actually need to bring it back down into more human, individual, direct connection, which I think our current technologies are enabling in ways that the internet, as it has been, wasn't able to accomplish. So I'm very eager to see some of that play out. All right, thank you. I'll be at the lunch area.
Great, thank you so much.